Welcome back to Fix It Fast, the podcast by Max Appliance Repair, episode 9. Last time we were talking all about those weird black marks on clothes after drying.
Oh,
But this time we're heating things up a bit,
literally.
talking about oven temperature fluctuations.
Yes.
You know, when your oven decides to just have a mind of its own and mess with your dinner.
Oh, yeah, that's a very common issue we see a lot.
But really?
Yeah, people just expect their ovens to, stay at the temperature they set it to.
Right. Like you set it to 350, you want it to be 350.
Yeah, but there's a lot more going on,
Yeah.
behind that dial.
I mean, baking is a science, so like even a little change
Yeah.
can make a big difference
Huge difference.
between, a perfect cake and a completely sunken disaster.
Exactly. So let's break down why your oven might be acting up like this.
Okay.
And we can start with maybe the most common thing we see, and that's calibration issues.
Calibration. I thought that was just for like fancy lab equipment.
No, not at all. Basically, over time, like a oven's thermostat, the thing that controls the temperature, it can drift.
Uh-huh.
Kind of like a clock that starts running slow.
Okay.
So you might think your oven's at 350,
Right.
but it could be off by 10 or even 20 degrees.
Wow, so it can be that far off.
It can be, yeah.
So how do we even know if an oven needs to be calibrated? Is there like a test?
Yeah, the best thing is to use a separate oven thermometer,
Okay.
not the one on the oven door.
Gotcha.
Those can be off too.
Okay.
So you preheat your oven, let's say to 350, let it stabilize,
Uh-huh.
and then you compare the reading on the thermometer to what the oven's set at.
Okay.
That'll tell you if you're in the right range.
Okay, and what if it's off? Like, can I fix that myself or do I have to call like a professional,
Yeah, well, a lot of ovens, they have a calibration adjustment. It's often behind the control knob.
Wow.
So if you're comfortable with a little DIY,
Yeah.
you can use a screwdriver
Okay.
to adjust it.
But honestly, if you're not really sure what you're doing,
Yeah.
it's better to call a technician because we've seen people
Right.
make things worse by messing with it.
Right. Better safe than...
Exactly.
So calibration's one thing, but what about when the oven just can't stay at a steady temperature? Like, is there something else going on there?
Yeah, sometimes it's not the thermostat itself, but the sensor that tells the thermostat what temperature it is.
Okay.
So that sensor, if it's broken, it's sending bad information to the oven, and so the oven's basically blind.
So the oven is working with bad information.
Yeah, it's working with bad information, so you get these swings in temperature, uneven, cooking, all that fun stuff.
That sounds really frustrating.
Yeah.
So what are some signs that it might be like a bad sensor?
Well, if your food's always coming out overcooked or undercooked,
Yeah.
even when you set the right temperature, that's a big sign.
Gotcha.
Also, if the oven takes forever to preheat, or you notice some parts of the oven are way hotter than others,
Okay.
it could be the sensor.
So I think it's the sensor. Can I test that at home? Is there a way to do that?
Some ovens have a diagnostic mode that can check the sensor, or you can use a multimeter to test its resistance. But honestly, replacing a sensor is usually a job for a pro.
Yeah, makes sense.
There's electrical stuff. You
Right.
don't want to mess with that.
Yeah, so, call us at Max Appliance Repair. We'll take care of that for you.
Exactly.
So we've talked about calibration sensors. What about when an oven just can't seem to hold heat?
Mm-hmm.
It takes forever to preheat, and then even when it does, it doesn't feel like it's the right temperature.
Yeah.
Could that be an insulation problem?
It definitely could be. Insulation is super important for keeping the heat inside the oven where it belongs.
Right.
But over time, that insulation can deteriorate. It can crack. It can get damaged.
Yeah.
And that's like having a hole in your winter coat. All that heat escapes. It wastes energy.
Wastes money.
Yeah, wastes money and messes with your cooking.
So how do we know if it's an insulation problem?
Well, like you said, long preheating times are a clue.
Okay.
You might also notice the outside of the oven getting really hot.
Mm-hmm.
That means heat's escaping.
Right.
And just like with a bad sensor, your food might not be cooking at the right temperature.
Okay, so are there any DIY checks for insulation, or is that a call a technician situation?
You can kind of look at it and see if there's any cracks or damage to the insulation,
Oh, okay.
but getting to it can be tricky depending on your oven.
Yeah.
But honestly, if you're seeing those other signs like long preheating times and the outside's getting really hot,
Uh-huh.
it's better to call us.
Uh-huh.
We can check it out and let you know what needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's a simple fix. Sometimes it means replacing the insulation.
Okay.
But we'll get you back up and running.
So we've covered calibration, we've covered sensors, we've covered insulation. Is there anything else that can cause these temperature fluctuations? There is. We'll talk about those after a quick break. Welcome back to Fix It Fast.
The podcast by Max Appliance Repair.
That's right.
We're on episode 9 talking about oven temperature fluctuations and, getting to the bottom of, why these things happen.
Yeah, and before the break, we were talking about all that stuff inside your oven, like calibration, the sensors.
Right, all the internal stuff.
The insulation, but there's more to the story.
Okay, I'm ready.
Yep.
What else could be causing these temperature swings? Could it be my oven door?
You're thinking in the right direction. The oven door and that seal, around it, that plays a big part in keeping the temperature steady inside.
Okay.
It's like a tight lid on a container.
Right, you don't want the heat to escape.
You don't want that heat escaping.
So if that seal is damaged or worn out, could that let heat out and make the oven work harder?
Exactly. And you might actually see, cracks in the seal.
Yeah.
Or you might feel like a blast of hot air when you open the door. That's a pretty sure sign it's not sealing, right?
Okay, so if I think it's the door seal, is there a way to test it myself?
Yeah, there's an easy test.
Okay.
You just take a piece of paper, put it between the seal and the door and close the door.
Okay.
And then try to pull the paper out. If it slides out easily, you've got a leak.
Okay, so if it is leaking, can I replace the seal myself or should I call a professional?
Replacing the seal is usually pretty easy, especially if you're handy.
Okay.
You can find them online or at a hardware store.
Gotcha.
Just check your oven's manual. It'll tell you exactly how to do it for your model.
Okay, so speaking of things we talked about earlier, you mentioned ventilation.
Right.
How does that factor into oven temperature and keeping it steady?
Ventilation is super important. It's how the oven controls the flow of hot air and fresh air to make sure the temperature stays consistent.
Okay.
But if that ventilation system is blocked or it's not working right, it can cause all sorts of problems.
What kind of problems are we talking?
Well, first off, your oven might take longer to preheat because the hot air isn't circulating right. You might also get uneven cooking because some parts of the oven are hotter than others.
Right.
Because the airflow is off. And, sometimes you'll notice steam or cooking smells kind of lingering in the oven even after you're done cooking.
Oh, yeah.
That could be a ventilation issue, too. It means the air isn't getting out like it should.
Okay, so making sure that your oven vents are clear and not blocked is super important. And if your oven has a fan, you should make sure that's working properly, too.
Absolutely. A faulty fan can really throw off the airflow and the temperature.
So, okay, we've talked about making sure the vents are clean, the fan's working. What about the stuff we put in the oven? Do our pots and pans matter and how we arrange them in there?
You know what? You're right. That actually does make a difference, believe it or not.
Really?
The cookware you use and how you arrange it can affect the oven's temperature and how your food cooks.
I never thought about that.
It's all about the different materials you see, like glass, metal, ceramic. They all conduct heat differently. Some materials hold on to heat more than others, and that can affect the overall temperature inside the oven and how fast your food cooks.
So, using a glass baking dish versus a metal one could actually change how my food turns out.
Absolutely. Metal bakeware. It's great for even heat distribution because it conducts heat so well.
Okay.
But glass and ceramic, even though they can look really nice, they tend to hold on to heat more. And sometimes that can lead to overcooked or even burnt dishes.
Okay, so material matters. What about placement? How many things I have in there at once? I've always wondered if it's okay to just cram a bunch of dishes in there.
That's a great question, but honestly, overcrowding your oven is a big no-no.
Okay.
When you stuff it full of dishes, you block the airflow.
Right.
That leads to uneven cooking, and you guessed it, temperature fluctuations.
So it's like trying to bake a cake in a crowded room where the heat can't circulate.
Exactly. You need to give your dishes some space for that hot air to move around freely.
Gotcha.
So if you're baking something that needs to cook evenly, like a cake cookies,
it's
a good idea to rotate the baking sheet halfway through to make sure every side gets equal heat.
So speaking of baking cakes, what about preheating? How important is that step, really?
Preheating is so important. It's like the foundation for good baking. You need to let the oven get to the right temperature before you put your food in.
Right.
That way you've got consistent heat from the beginning.
Okay, so you're saying skipping preheating is like trying to bake a cake in a cold oven.
Pretty much, it's not going to turn out right.
Okay, so preheating is a must.
Yeah.
But is there a right way to preheat?
There is. First off, read the recipe.
Okay.
Some recipes have specific instructions for preheating.
Right.
Then make sure you actually set the correct temperature. It's easy to get distracted and set it to the wrong thing.
Oh, yeah, I've done that.
We all have. And here's a big one. Avoid opening the oven door while it's preheating. Every time you peek, you're letting out heat. and the oven has to work harder to get back up to temperature.
So it's like trying to heat your house in the winter with the front door open.
Exactly. You're just wasting energy and making the preheating take longer. And then lastly, use an oven thermometer to double check the temperature, especially if you think your oven's thermostat might be a little off.
Okay, so we've covered a lot about what goes on inside the oven.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any external things that could be affecting the temperature?
You know what there are? It's not just about what's happening inside the oven.
Okay.
Stuff outside of it can play a role too, like the room temperature, the altitude, even where your oven's placed can impact how well it holds a steady temperature.
Wow, I would not have thought of that.
Yeah, so for example, if it's a super hot day and your kitchen's already warm, that can actually make your oven run hotter than usual.
Interesting.
But if it's freezing cold, your oven might have a tough time reaching the temperature you set it to.
Okay, so baking in extreme temperatures can be tricky.
It can be, yeah.
What about altitude?
Altitude affects things too.
How so?
It affects how water boils and how food cooks.
Okay.
If you live in a high-altitude area, the air pressure is lower, and that can affect your baking times and temperatures. You might need to adjust your recipes or how you cook to compensate.
So it's not just about setting the oven to 350. It's about understanding that other factors can change what's really going on in there.
Exactly. And lastly, where you put your oven can make a difference too.
Okay.
Putting it near a window or a drafty door can make it cool down, but putting it next to a heat source like a radiator can make it run hotter.
So you got to find the sweet spot for your oven.
Exactly. You want it away from drafts, direct sunlight, and heat sources. Think of it like creating a nice, stable environment for your oven to do its thing.
Gotcha. A happy oven, happy baking.
Right. But before we move on,
okay,
I think it's important to talk about regular maintenance.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Maintenance is key for any appliance.
It is just like your car needs tune-ups.
Right.
Your oven needs a little TLC too.
So what kind of maintenance are we talking about here?
Well, keeping it clean is a big one. Built up grease and food can block them. Those vents affect airflow and even cause fires.
Oh, wow.
So regular cleaning, it's important for how well your oven works and for safety.
And I'm guessing, checking those temperature settings and calibrating the oven every once in a while is important too.
Absolutely. Calibration, it can drift over time.
Yeah.
So checking it and adjusting it. Make sure you're getting those accurate temperatures. It's like making sure your thermometer is giving you the right reading.
What about the door seal and insulation? How often should we be looking at those?
It's a good idea to just look at them every few months.
Okay.
Look for any wear and tear, cracks, tears, damage.
Right.
It's better to address it sooner than later.
So a little preventative maintenance can go a long way.
It's exactly catching those small issues before they turn into big problems. And remember, if you're ever unsure about something or you notice anything weird with your oven, don't be afraid to call a professional.
Right.
We're here to help.
Speaking of professionals, I heard some pretty interesting stories from our technicians here at Max Appliance Repair.
I bet you have what's one of the most memorable ones.
Well, we had a customer who was convinced their oven was possessed.
Possessed?
Yeah, they were having all these issues with
But what kind of issues?
Temperature was all over the place. The lights were flickering.
Wow.
And they swore they heard, weird noises coming from it.
No way.
They were totally convinced that it was haunted.
Oh my gosh, so what happened? Did our technician find an actual ghost in there?
Well, after a thorough inspection, our technician found the culprit.
Okay.
It wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural.
Okay.
Turns out a little mouse had built a nest inside the oven's control panel.
A mouse.
A mouse, yeah.
That's hilarious. And it was chewing on wires, which was causing all sorts of electrical mayhem.
Oh my gosh.
That explains the temperature fluctuations and the flickering lights and all the strange sounds.
That's incredible. So it just goes to show, sometimes the weirdest problems have the simplest explanations.
Yeah.
And it really highlights why it's so important to keep your oven clean and free of any unwanted guests.
Absolutely. Now, before we move on to the future of ovens and all that cool tech, I think we should talk about some common myths and misconceptions.
Oh, yeah.
About oven temperatures. I've heard so many over the years, and it's time to set the record straight.
I'm ready. Let's debunk some myths.
Welcome back to Fix It Fast, the podcast by Max Appliance Repair. We are wrapping up episode 9, and you know what that means? It's myth-busting time.
Yes.
We've talked about all the things that can go wrong with your oven temperature, but now it's time to, clear up some of the misconceptions that we hear all the time.
Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there.
Okay, so first up, one I've heard is you should always preheat your oven to the highest temperature possible. is any truth to that?
No, that's a myth. You don't need to crank it up to the highest setting just to cook things faster.
Right.
In fact, doing that can damage your oven, and it can actually lead to uneven cooking.
Okay, so each recipe has its own optimal temperature, and going higher isn't always better.
Yeah.
What about never opening the oven door while you're baking? Is that like a hard and fast rule?
I think we've all been guilty of peeking in there to see how things are going.
Oh, yeah.
A quick peek isn't going to ruin your dish.
Okay.
It's the constant opening and closing that really messes with the temperature.
Right, because every time you open the door, heat escapes.
Exactly, and then the oven has to work harder to get back up to temperature.
So speaking of variations, is it true that like all ovens are basically the same? Like 350 degrees in one oven is 350 degrees in any oven?
That's another myth.
Okay.
Different brands and models, they definitely have different heating capabilities, and their temperature accuracy can vary. Some ovens are known for having hot spots, while others might run a bit cooler.
Okay.
So it's really about getting to know your own oven.
So if every oven kind of has its own personality, what are some tips for like getting the most consistent temperature possible?
Well, first, get yourself a good oven thermometer.
Okay.
That way you're not just relying on the oven's thermostat, which can be off.
Gotcha.
Calibration, we talked about it earlier.
Right.
But it's super important to calibrate your oven regularly. That ensures accuracy.
Okay.
And don't be afraid to experiment a little.
Yeah.
Try using different baking sheets, different oven racks. Play around with your preheating methods to see what works best for your oven.
Okay, so after all this talk about oven temperatures, I have to ask, what are you excited about for like the future of ovens? What kind of new technology are you seeing out there?
Oh, that's a fun question. One of the most exciting things is the rise of smart ovens.
Smart ovens?
Yeah.
Okay, tell me more.
Think about it, ovens that are connected to the internet. With all these features that make cooking so much easier, you can control them from your phone.
Really?
You can preheat the oven from work, you can adjust the cooking times, even get notifications when your food's ready.
So no more burnt dinners because I forgot about it.
Exactly. And some smart ovens even have cameras built in.
Oh, wow.
So you can check on your food without opening the door. And some even use like artificial intelligence to like figure out the best cooking settings based on what you're making. It's like having a personal chef right in your kitchen.
That's amazing. What about like temperature control? Are there any new advancements there?
Absolutely. A lot of modern ovens now have super precise temperature sensors.
Okay.
And they use fancy algorithms to make sure the heating is really accurate and consistent.
So no more hot spots or crazy temperature swings.
That's the idea.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive into the world of oven temperatures. We've covered so much.
You have.
From like how your oven works to all the cool new tech that's coming out.
It's an exciting time for ovens.
What's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
I think it's that ovens can seem complicated, but if you know a little bit about how they work, you can solve problems, get them working their best, and make some really amazing food.
Well said. And remember, if you ever run into trouble with your oven, whether it's a simple calibration issue or something more serious, the team at Max Appliance Repair is always here to help.
We're passionate about keeping your appliances working so you can enjoy cooking and eating delicious meals.
So until next time, happy cooking, everyone.